All right. And so now next on the stage, we're going to be having Iddo Gino. Let's see if we can have him here right now.
Hey, how are you doing?
Hello. Good to see you. Where are you connecting with us from today?
From San Francisco.
All right. They told me that it's actually not that hot. It's probably 65 degrees. That's what they told me.
Well, I'm in a sweater, so yeah.
That really summarizes the situation. I'm envious. Anyway, today Iddo is the CEO of RapidAPI, and today he's going to be talking and sharing his experiences about the key 8 components for building a modern API stack. With that, Iddo, the stage is yours. Feel free to ask questions, people, and we'll see you at the end of the presentation. Take it away.
Sounds great. Thanks for entering me, and I'm really excited to be here today and talk about what we at RapidAPI view as the modern API stack and some of the core components that feed into that API stack. By way of introduction, again, my name is Iddo. I'm the founder and CEO of RapidAPI. We're the largest API marketplace in the world, so if you're looking for APIs or have APIs that you want to publish, RapidAPI today has over 30,000 public APIs that are available for anybody to use, a lot of free APIs, some paid ones that can go into your applications. We also have over 3 million developers actively using our platform. So if you're looking for a place to publish your API, RapidAPI is a great spot for that. And we also have an enterprise offering that helps companies manage and collaborate on their internal APIs. I won't share too much about that on the talk today, but if you have any questions about any of those offerings or any questions about anything that I'm talking about here today, you have my email on the screen now. It's iddo@rapidapi.com. Feel free to reach out to me or to anyone else on the RapidAPI team, and we'll be more than happy to talk about anything API related. So with that in mind, I'm excited to hop into the talk for today, which, as I mentioned, will be about the core components of a modern API stack. I want to start a little bit by just outlining some of the core trends or shifts that we're seeing with the proliferation and growth of APIs, especially in the enterprise architecture, but also with how we see the API environment evolving and some of the transitions in technologies and requirements that we're seeing around that. I'm also going to touch about what all tooling looks like and how we view the modern API toolchain for building APIs, and I'll try and make sure that I leave at least 5 minutes at the end open for questions and answers. So just outlining the proliferation of APIs, we've seen a huge increase in the number and volume of APIs that large enterprise companies have in their architecture over the last 2 years. And we constantly see with customers and companies that we're engaging with that as the number of developers in the organization grows, the number of APIs in those organizations actually grows dramatically. And many companies that we work with end up having hundreds and in some cases even thousands of internal APIs that they are working with. And it's not just internal APIs. It actually ends up being a combination of internal APIs, so those produced by internal teams and used by other internal teams to build applications and software. Some partner APIs, so APIs are exposed to their partners and customers to connect to, and third-party public APIs that they're either exposing to public or consuming from other companies. So it's a very big and complex API landscape and a lot of the companies we're engaged with. And that shift or that growth in the volume of APIs is triggering a whole new way that companies and developers are looking at their API landscape. So we really see a shift in the API environment in a lot of companies from what we describe as the old way or the legacy way of thinking about APIs to the next generation view that companies and architects have in and around APIs. And this shift can actually be characterized by a few core transitions that are part of it. The first one is just looking at the volume and number of those APIs. So when companies in the past used to talk about tens, maybe a few dozens of APIs, now we see companies constantly talking about hundreds and even thousands of APIs and needing to find tools and platforms that support that. We also see a transition from a technology perspective from looking at just REST and SOAP to still looking at those a lot, but also having GraphQL-based APIs and asynchronous APIs with Kafka and other queue technologies and streams, and webhooks and gRPC and WebSockets, so a lot of different types of APIs in a far less homogeneous environment. We're also seeing a core transition of APIs not just running in a data center or a single private cloud, but running in a bunch of different places. It's a much more hybrid environment with multi-cloud and on-prem and service mesh and serverless. And that kind of trend also means that instead of just having either none or a single large API gateway, companies are now running APIs in a bunch of different runtimes with a bunch of different technologies. From an organizational perspective, there's a big shift from a single team building those APIs to now multiple teams building those APIs. And that also means that from an access control model perspective, and I think the last conversation actually talked about this quite a lot and kind of emphasized a lot of that transition, we're going from basic access controls to much more fine-grained access of who can edit, who can view, and who can consume the different APIs. So there's a big fundamental shift in how companies are looking at their API environments and what exists within those environments. And that also means that the tooling has to change with it. So when we talk about first generation tooling, or what a lot of people consider the classical API management stack, there are a few traits about it that just don't fit into the modern environment. So first of all, it's optimized for environments with not a lot of APIs, and that are predominantly or only based on SOAP and RESTful APIs. It's centered around runtime components. So everything is built around this gateway or a runtime component that's the centerpiece of the platform. Any tools that go around it are usually not part of the core platform and are glued or stuck together to it, oftentimes with a very manual integration process. What happens with a lot of these tools is the tooling is at the forefront, and they're not built to support a smooth development flow. They're also not built to support continuous delivery and continuous integration and other trends that are pretty prevalent with how developers are thinking about delivering APIs and microservices these days. And I think if I had to summarize this slide, a lot of it is built around runtime networking components with the development tooling kind of stuck onto it as an afterthought. But when we think about the modern API development tool chain and what companies are looking at bringing into their architecture now, first of all, it's supporting a wide range of APIs, so both large in number, but also a lot more heterogeneous in technology. So supporting SOAP, REST, but also GraphQL, asynchronous APIs, WebSockets, webhooks, and all those different types of APIs that exist in the architecture. It has to be runtime agnostic, so acknowledging that there's going to be APIs running in the cloud, but also on-prem, and also asynchronous APIs, and also service mesh and serverless. And whatever technology needs to be there, the development plane and the runtime plane have to be separate so they're not dependent on one another. All of those different point tools also need to be a lot more tightly integrated and tightly coupled with one another. So the development workflow from designing the API and developing it with an API client all the way through testing, monitoring, and publishing all needs to happen in one place. And developers don't want to have to combine and use a bunch of separate tools for that. And most importantly, that is also built there to support integrating with CI/CD workflows and tooling. So if I kind of had to summarize, or I think one of the most important aspects of this is moving from a runtime-centric to a development-centric approach. So where the old API management tools, all the thinking was built around the runtime, the gateway, with developer tooling for APIs being an afterthought that was slapped onto it. The new thinking is the development tools or the developer workflow is the most important thing, and the runtime is going to shift and be varied anyways. So it shouldn't be considered the centerpiece or the most important component of that platform. So with this in mind, where I want to spend a lot of the talk today is talking about how I view and how we at RapidAPI view that modern API development toolchain. And specifically, I'm going to look at it from two angles that are very closely connected together. That of the API builders. So think about the API construction and building workflow from designing the APIs through to building it, deploying it, testing it, and publishing it. But also, and this is really important because I think this is often neglected by a lot of people in how they think about the API toolchain, looking at it from the angle of the API consumer and talking about the journey of discovering APIs, evaluating them, integrating those APIs into the applications that are being built, and monitoring how those APIs and those integrations are impacting the application in the longer term. And for the next few minutes, I just want to break down each one of these parts and talk a little bit about the tooling and requirements that are critical within those components of the tool chain. So starting off, I want to talk about design. And this is, a lot of people have been talking in recent years, and it's a trend that I couldn't agree more with, about viewing API design or viewing API development almost like product development. So there needs to be a mentality where every API is a product. It has a user base, it has consumers, and it influences how people are thinking about API design and development life cycles and bringing a lot of product management thinking into it. So I think with that mindset, the design has to be the first phase of any API development workflow. And it's where that product mentality comes into place. The design process should also support collaboration and things like versioning to make sure that it's not just a singular design process, it also supports versioning and the API evolving over time as new requirements and new use cases come into play. When we talk about API design, this is actually from a survey that we conducted earlier in the year. Over 86% of larger enterprises are actually looking at formalizing the API design processes and creating standardized tooling to support that product thinking and to make sure both from a usability standpoint, but also from a governance standpoint, that API design is kind of uplifted and becomes a more permanent part of the workflow. And I think, and this is the last kind of slide I'm going to share about API design, there's a lot of great tooling out there to look at. Generally, when we look at a lot of these tooling, there are two high-level approaches that people choose. Either a client-first approach, where you're optimizing for quick development and combining the design tool with also a local client that developers can use as they're developing and building the API locally. And spec-first tool, where the design process and development process are entirely separated. And I will call out here, we actually do have a dog in this fight, or a wolf, I should say. Paw is a company that we recently acquired into RapidAPI. It's a tool that's part of the RapidAPI ecosystem. And I might be a little biased here, but I also think it's a great API design and client tool. But there are other great tools out there. Some of them are also making an appearance in this conference. So I definitely recommend thinking of API design as the first fundamental tool or step in API building and making sure that there is great tooling and processes to support that. The next step in the tool chain is building and deploying those APIs. So the building step, there's a lot of standardized tooling already out there for programming and developing software. So IDEs, text editor, and any tools that you have in and around that, and the CI/CD pipeline to build them. I think that the most important thing to acknowledge here is that when building APIs, those APIs get deployed everywhere. You're going to have APIs running in the data center, but also APIs running in the cloud, serverless APIs running in the cloud too, and perhaps at some point a service mesh with APIs and microservices running on it. And it's important that the entire build and deploy step or part of the process is built to support all of these different deployment strategies and deployment arenas. The next step, and I think that it's often neglected in planning for the API toolchain, but it's actually very important, is looking at testing and monitoring. So with testing and monitoring, it has to be part of the API construction workflow. And I think from my perspective, one of the most important things that organizations and companies are trying to drive with their API strategy is better reuse of resources. So if a team already built an API or built a microservices, other teams can leverage that, but also using that to speed up development and reduce time to market, so developers can rely and leverage existing platforms and existing APIs in the architecture. Testing is critical to support that because it means that people and developers can trust that the APIs work, can trust that they're going to support them well, and leverage them pretty quickly without having to worry about those APIs not functioning correctly. So testing and monitoring is critical for a successful API platform. I also think that it's a very good thing to invest in from a quality perspective. API quality is important to driving adoption. It also has a lot of added value. It can support moving towards a CI/CD process and monitoring APIs in production to get insights into production downtimes. And it's not actually that hard. There's great tooling out there, and APIs, unlike UIs, actually lend themselves very nicely to testing. They're very schema-driven, and it's easy to separate out in UI and unit test APIs, basically. And it's important when looking at API testing tools to think, I always like to think about it as a triangle, so the triad of the three components for API testing. One of them is contract validation, so actually making that APIs meet the contract or the documentations and specs that they put out. But also, and this is the part that people often start from, but it's important to go beyond that and also think about functional validation and performance validations of those APIs. I'm not going to talk much more about API testing here. We do have some separate resources on RapidAPI that talk about API testing. And again, I will call out here, we have RapidAPI testing, which is our platform for testing and monitoring APIs, which does give out-of-the-box contract validation for APIs, but also deep functional validation and performance monitoring and validation for APIs. So I definitely recommend looking at that if you're thinking about your API testing and monitoring tooling. And there are also other great products out there as part of that. And I'll just also call out that according to our last survey, also around 92% of developers plan to test their APIs in 2021. Looking at this number, I'm honestly kind of worried about the 8% that don't. But I definitely recommend looking at that and prioritizing API testing as part of the API development workflow. And then the last step, so number 4, is looking at API publishing. And this one seems simple, right? You have the API designs, it's built, it's deployed, you have it tested, obviously. Now you just need to put it out there. I think that it's really important to think about a few aspects of the publishing workflow and making sure that there are tools in the organization that support that. First of all, it's the ability to define who can access the API. So think about the roles, the permissions, and the viewing rights for that API. It's also really important to publish the full API. And I say this because I think especially for internal microservices, a lot of people will just put the spec or the open API file out there and say, hey, there is the API, go use it. And there is a lot of surprise afterwards when there is no adoption and reuse internally of that API. Well, an API publishing goes beyond just the spec for the API. There is a very comprehensive envelope that needs to go around it. So think about tutorials, how-to guides, explanation, examples. All of that's important to actually driving reuse of the API and essentially making it a self-serviceable API. So again, when building the toolchain, support all of these aspects of API construction, not just putting the spec out there and sharing it with the team. It's much bigger than that. So up until now, we talked about the 4 steps or components that relate to building and publishing APIs, and basically the API builder's journey. Now I want to pivot quickly and talk about the tools that are critical for the API consumers or the people who are going to be using those APIs. So now we're going to talk about that side of the spectrum, which I think is just as important, if not more important. So the first step, obviously, for API consumers is discovering those APIs. And I can't stress this enough. There has to be a single place that makes it very easy to search and discover APIs in the organization. Don't make it hard for people to find APIs and have to chase down the documentation and the references and everything. Make it easy to find APIs with all the filtering and the searching, and then get to the documentation very quickly. So setting up that internal platform where all those APIs can live is probably the most important step when setting up the toolchain for APIs. But more than just presenting the documentation, a good toolchain will allow developers to very easily evaluate those APIs. And one of the things that I was talking about, and at Rapid, it's actually one of our core product metrics, is a concept called time to 200. So how quickly from getting to an API, so I've done the discovery step, I found an API that seems to be a good fit. How much time does it take to me to make a request to that API, get back a successful response, and hopefully that can be a 200 success response. So I know that the API is working, I've used it, I've seen a real live example, and I know how to integrate with that API. And I think that it's important to not just give any access to this API, but make it as real as possible. So ideally, if you can give production access to the API, that's amazing. And so with some cases, that's not possible. So there should be a playground. And the absolute worst case, but still invest in doing that if all else is not possible, at least have mock responses for the API. Just let people get to a playground or get to a client and test that API very, very quickly. The next step is integration. And I think here having that same time to 200 mentality is really important. So how quickly from making a successful response myself can I actually integrate that and make a successful response from my application? So that's the time to 200 thinking. Having code snippets and SDKs goes a long way towards helping that. And actually having code examples or examples on GitHub helps quite a long way too. And then the last step, and I want to make sure that I'm leaving some time for questions, so I'm going to do this quickly. The last step is monitoring. So if I'm a developer and I've integrated a bunch of different APIs into my application, so I've discovered them, I've evaluated them, they're the right fit, now they're integrated, and they're a dependency of my application in runtime, I want to be able to monitor that and make sure that they are working properly and understand how they're impacting the application. So providing tools like APMs and dashboards and platforms that can show all the dependencies for the application and visualize how they're impacting the performance of those applications, that's critical. And I would definitely invest as part of the tool chain in building tooling in and around that. So they very quickly were able to talk about the builder journey and the consumer journey. And I think that it's important to put together a tool chain that supports both of these personas, but also has the best possible tools that are well integrated together in each one of those junctions or in each step in the development workflow. So that is the high level. And then I do think we have a few minutes left. Would love to answer any questions that arise around that.
Okay, and I'm back here. Thank you very much for the talk. And we do have some questions and clarification that the people have been asking. So let's go through that. We have some time. First of all, you've been talking about the consumer side that often gets ignored, and effectively speaking, it all goes down to this idea that there is a empathy missing on the receiving side. And why do you think that's happening? Why do you think people neglect the people using the API so much, up to the point that they just go crazy about it?
Yeah, I think, and that's a great question. I think that there is a miss. So first of all, a lot of companies, when they think about API platforming, there are always two sides to this coin. There's the internal APIs that are created internally and serve internal consumers and developers. And then there are APIs that you're externalizing. Now, I think that when companies go and or actually I should say before that, I think that companies spend a lot more time and get to it a lot quicker investing in the APIs that they're externalizing and exposing to developers outside of the organization before actually having, and pardon my French on this, but before they actually have their shit figured out internally and have been able to organize the APIs and services within their company that their own developers are using. And in the long term, that ends up hurting the developer experience within the company and the ability to develop new services and applications quickly. So I think that the first thing is you need to look internally first. And a lot of time when people look internally, because they're like, oh, the people consuming those APIs, those are just other people in the company. They can go over and talk to whoever created the API. So it's easy to neglect or not spend too much time thinking about the consumer journey. And I think that's a misconception or a pitfall that a lot of companies fall into.
All right, very good. Let's go to the next question. Again, you have a huge API marketplace, and so we're curious about numbers. How common is for people to use terrible error messages like returning 200 when the thing just didn't work?
Yeah, I think that API bad practices in APIs is something that it's an ailment that exists in a lot of APIs, and we've seen that a lot, and it's one of the things that I personally get frustrated with. But I think that there are two things to balance here. When creating the platform, a lot of companies are thinking, hey, we want to have a comprehensive API platform that actually includes all the APIs, but also we only want to put great APIs in it. And one of the areas where I've seen organizations go, or one of the roads where I've seen organizations go, is kind of saying, hey, we want to clean up all the APIs before we put them in the internal platform. But what inevitably ends up happening is you don't put anything in the platform because all of the APIs are in some stage of cleanup. So I would say getting a comprehensive platform and putting all the APIs in one place is more important than having every API be perfect. They're never going to be perfect. Just strive towards best practices.
I like, the way I call this shame-driven development. Like, I'm not going to publish that. Otherwise, those guys are just going to point my finger at me all the time. And so here's the cleanup. Here's the cleanup section. All right. We don't have any more time for questions, unfortunately, but we're going to make sure to forward the other ones. And please take a look at the channel. There might be other questions coming up. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much for being with us today, Iddo, and hopefully we'll see you soon again. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Definitely. Thank you.